Welcome to LaunchPod, a product management podcast brought to you by LogRocket. Today, while those of us in the US are taking time this week away from work, we're bringing you some of our favorite snippets from LaunchPod. On today's episode, you'll hear from Kristin Dorsett about prioritizing big bets, Steve Chazin about how working at Apple in the 90s with Steve Jobs transformed how he managed product, and Gunn, who talks about workback plans focused on a design North Star. First up, we have Kristen Dorsett, CPO at Viator, talking about how she prioritizes and gathers data and how that impacts her big bet initiatives.
There's a lot of ways to pick and a lot of ways to prioritize and gather data. I've definitely found over time, a lot of them don't work that well, or a lot of them will yield you results are kind of mixed. There's a few really good ways to do it. It varies depending on your business, and usually the good ways are the hardest ones. So how do you guys do that over at Viator? What does that look like? How do you discover what you need to be working on and what you need to prioritize? And I think you put it well, like what are the big rocks in your plan?
So I'll talk a bit of how overall we plan as a company and then how that translates into what we work in product. So overall as a company, we have a sort of longer term strategy and vision for where we want to go, like where we're going to play, how we're going to win. And then that translates every year into our annual company OKRs. And this is, okay, for this year, these are the 5 things that we're going to be focused on as a business. And then what we do is have a bit of a bottoms up process of, okay, what are those big bets that we want to make as a company that we think will help us achieve these outcomes that we're looking for? And I say it's bottoms up. It's a bit bottoms up and tops down because we have some things, bigger strategic things that we know what we want to go after and capabilities that we want to be building. And so some of those we all have to write proposals. So even I will write a big bet proposal every half for things that I want to see happen. And then we basically assess all of these proposals and decide, okay, what are the ones that we think will drive the most immediate short-term impact, as well as what are the ones that are the more longer-term strategic rocks that we want to be making sure we're making progress against. And we get that list down to 10 to 12 things typically. And those are the big initiatives that R&D focuses on. And that takes up about 50% of our team's capacity is the aim. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. And the goal would be like, these are the big bets, these are the big rocks. And then teams each have their own individual charter of this is the part of the journey we want you to be optimizing. This is the customer problems we want you to be solving. And the teams can fill in the rest of their roadmap with the team-driven work that helps drive their charter forward. Yeah,
I think that it's great to have the agility to move quickly, but at the same time, you need enough time to actually do something impactful. So
yeah. Oh, and back to the prioritization of those bets, which I didn't really answer. So for every single bet proposal, we do have an opportunity size. That's a very back of the envelope. And we're looking at the short-term versus long-term impact. Mm-hmm. And so we were weighing, okay, that actual opportunity size, what are the biggest opportunities we could be going after, layered in with the strategic side. Like sometimes we'll do something and maybe it's a bit smaller opportunity size, but is more strategic. And then sometimes it's just those compliance things that come in that you just have to do.
It's always the things you have to do that just are no negotiation. That's when you want that optimizer in there, that right person who knows going to button it up, do it right, and just get it done.
Yeah, hyper detailed people on those.
Yeah. Going kind of one step down below that kind of planning, how do you all get there? What fuels kind of those proposals, or what gets you to that kind of level of knowing having the hypothesis that you think is going to move the business, right? I'm sure there's lots of different kinds of data out there. I think PMs are in the enviable and probably unenviable position of there is no shortage of data information you can use. So what's the process over in the product or at Viator to understand that from a data perspective, or to get your inspiration or drive these projects forward?
We definitely have a lot of sources for data. So we start at the more macro level, looking at the market, and we do market research around, okay, what's American traveler trends, and what are the different things that different personas of travelers are looking for, specifically for experiences. So that's one lens we take, is how do we super serve those personas that we've decided we want to be super serving. Then we take it down to user research. And we do a lot of qualitative research with our customers, existing and prospective, of what's going well in our product now, where is the friction in our journey. When we're rolling out features, we do usability testing before we roll them out to make sure that people can do the thing they're trying to do. And so that produces a really rich data set. We also have a voice of the customer program where we're collating all of the data we get from all of the written and spoken contacts we have with customers. So everything from customer service contacts, both phone, email, chat, as well as all the reviews that come in, as well as external reviews like App Store or Trustpilot. And we put it all in a big database, use a bunch of models to get insights out of it. And it helps tell us some of the themes of where we could do better. And it's one of our most valuable tools. Like it can tell us even down to this page in this destination is causing problems. And so that's qualitative. And then on the quantitative side, we have product analytics tooling, obviously, just like we have BI tooling where we can help use it to spot opportunities as well.
I'm really curious about this voice of customer program because I read, you talked about it before, and it gets into the point of even being a queryable database of customer feedback. And that's one thing in a B2B tool. You have hundreds of customers, maybe a few thousand, but Viator has I think I read 300,000 vendors alone, let alone end customers. So can you talk about how you do this? Because that's just that could be a product unto itself almost. That's a massive undertaking.
It is basically an internal product. It's owned and driven out of our customer experience team. They actually created it originally because they were looking at all the contacts we have coming into our call center. And they were trying to figure out, okay, how do we make some of this self-service so that these travelers don't have to talk to a customer service agent at all? And so we started with just that job in mind. And over time, have just added more and more data to it. It is an internal product. And I mean, there's a small team that owns it and continues to bring it forward.
This is one of those things I always love to hear about because I could talk to you for an entire hour just about this. Can you talk about maybe with that level of data, what have you been able to do with that? What has that actually driven from an end result? Can you talk maybe about a project or a change that you guys have been able to pull out that was material that came from that program?
There's dozens. When I asked the head of this program to give me some wins, she had a very long list. But one I'll talk about is we have recently been investing a lot in our app. And we're seeing more and more of our travelers using our app versus our mobile web or desktop experiences. But our measurement of our app isn't as strong because it's less mature. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what are the biggest customer problems we're seeing in the app? And so we mined the voice of the customer data. And the overwhelming theme was manage my booking, was just one of the key jobs to be done that people were really struggling with. And it was actually driving cancellations. And so it came out loud and clear in the data. And it's a big enough opportunity that it became a big bet. And we've spent the last year trying to make those jobs to be done a lot easier. And we use the voice of the customer data to mine, okay, when people are in this part of the app, what are the other things they're calling CS about? Or what are the other things that we're hearing about in the App Store reviews? And we were able to come up with a short list of, okay, these 5 jobs, we're not meeting expectations right now. And we've been working through and fixing them.
And how does that kind of slim down process work? Because I'm sure with that many users, it's not like something where you can go off of, 20 people mentions. I'm sure there's even the most esoteric things get a few mentions. How are you really narrowing in on what those 5 priorities are from this?
So I think we use voice of the customer as a canary in the coal mine often. It's telling us where the problems are. It may not be able to tell us the size of them because again, it may only be 20 of these customers that actually picked up the phone and called CS about it. But it's enough and it spikes in the tool and we're like, okay, there's a problem there. Let's go size the problem. And that's where we will then lean into our product analytics tooling or do user research studies to really get into the underlying why.
Next, we have Steve Chazin, VP of Products at Alarm.com, who came on to talk about his experience working at Apple in the 90s and how the experience working with Steve Jobs impacted how he works with product today.
So I joined in 1991 when Apple was a rocket ship. They could do no wrong. By 97, the wheels started to fall off that bus. Steve had left 2 or 3 years before I joined, and the company really had lost its way. What was working before and all their unique value was sort of usurped by Microsoft. Right? Windows 95 kind of copied everything that was unique about the Mac, and there was really a vacuum of leadership. So I really loved working at Apple, but I didn't like those times. And I resigned in right around 1997, right after Jobs had come back as a special advisor to Gil Amelio, which was really more of a marketing ploy then to get the company some attention and sort of extend a lifeline to them. But they really had no product roadmap, no developer roadmap. It was really dark days. And almost nobody knows how close to going out of business Apple came in those days. And so I wrote a note to my boss and I just said, hey, look, I'm a fan. I'm a shareholder. I'll be rooting from the sidelines, and copied sjobs@pixar.com, which was the only email address I could find for him at the time. And a couple of days later, he calls with my boss on a speakerphone and told me to get back in the game, get off the sidelines. He used a more colorful language. And I got to essentially write my job description because I told him what we should do, and he said, go do it. And I was able to do that and work directly for him for the next 18 months. I told him it would take 2 years. We got it done in a year and a half. And it was a really exciting time. It really kind of wrote the formula for Apple's resurgence, really listening to customers, understanding what the product needed to do versus pushing what you had on the shelf at people. And it changed my life in the way of how to build great products and understand why you build great products.
Wow. What was the project you worked on?
So I reconstituted what was called the Apple University Consortium. And if you remember the early days of Apple, the Mac was so different back in the late 80s that no one really wanted to write software for it. So Jobs went to the university market and handpicked like 25 schools and said that if you will endorse this platform for your students, teach them about technology, which is going to be in their lives, and that's the mission of a university, we'll give it to you at the cost it cost us to make it. And so in the early days, that worked. There was a bunch of very well-known universities that built a lot of the early software on the Mac and standardized on it long before anybody thought a student needed to buy a computer in college. And that worked in the early days of Apple, and I kind of rebuilt it again in the late 90s when the same problem was happening. All the developers were leaving the platform. Windows looked like the future. And a lot of universities had committed so heavily to Apple that if Apple went out of business, they had to start over. They were completely 100% requiring every one of their students to buy a Mac on matriculation. So it was tough for them to admit that future. So we knew they wanted us to survive. We needed them to survive. So it was this match made in heaven. And every 3 to 4 months, we'd invite them out to Cupertino. We would show them what we were working on. We'd get their feedback. At a certain point in the presentation, Steve would kick out all the Apple people like me and talk directly to the university leaders and really drill into them why they were important and why we needed each other. And again, most people don't know, but the foundation for the Mac OS then was partially built by these universities themselves. The Mac kernel was built on a Carnegie Mellon foundational shell called Andrew or Mach. And Dartmouth and Harvard and MIT all built a lot of the plumbing for it. In return, we gave them an open source license to the Mac, which again, most people have not even paid attention to that because they didn't want to commit to Apple in the event Apple went out of business unless they had the code to continue their enterprise. And again, it was very fortunate that Steve agreed to do that, and that helped turn the company around. And The product we showed them was the iMac, which in many ways was built for the university customers in mind.
Got it. So you were working together with all these universities to develop the next big operating system, and that's what sort of usurped the Windows 95.
It was the future of the Mac. Again, there was only the System 7, System 8. That was their platform, but they had to take what the universities had built, which was the foundation for Next in itself, and then build on top of that all the components to make it into a robust operating system with all the security and platform requirements. And a lot of that was built by these university partners, converting it from what was running on the Next platform to the Mac hardware. And then later on doing it again when they converted to the Intel platform.
How did you get that done in 18 months? Was it a mad dash or nights and weekends? What were going there?
A little bit of both. I lived in New Hampshire at the time, but my office was in California. So I would spend 2 weeks out there living at the Saratoga Inn in Saratoga, California, commuting to the Apple office and working well into the evening to make that stuff work. And that was also the same place we'd put the university leaders in Saratoga. And so we kind of like gave them a nice place for them to work together. So we benefited from having all these motivated individuals focusing on the same problem, which was save Apple, and then committing to buy the platform that they were putting their ideas into. So it was really a very unique time, and it worked. I mean, the iMac, not just the software and the hardware, but the marketing around it saved the company, even though technically it was no different than what we were selling 18 months before. It gave us that leg up to go. And in the meantime, the thing we were doing behind the scenes was the Think Different campaign to get people to think different about Apple and why they wanted a computer in the first place.
Very cool. Yeah, it goes to show how much of software is just getting the messaging out and people knowing what you do. And that's great. Are there any like Steve Jobs anecdotes or lessons that you kind of have taken with you, or maybe some that you've like shied away from having worked with him?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing is really understanding why you're building the product. A lot of companies, they have a hit product and then they kind of milk that forever, but they stop thinking about why they built the product in the first place or who they built it for. Steve was always insistent that the people who were building the product were using it constantly. Like the feedback came from the users of it, not from the designers or a piece of paper. The other piece, which is unique to Apple, and it's something I took to the rest of my career, is typically marketing and sales are on one side of the business and product and engineering are on the other. And when times get tough, they point at each other. The product people and the engineering people say, hey, why can't you sell what we gave you? And the marketing and sales people say, what you sold me can't be sold. I mean, what you gave me can't be sold. And at Apple, it's not like that at all. Before you start writing code or building a design, you decide what the message is, why it exists, its reason for being. And then everything stems from that. And you get a very clear picture of why you're putting a feature in or why you don't need that feature. And saying no becomes this liberating activity because you don't have to add that feature if it doesn't support the reason it should exist to begin with. And a lot of companies forget that, but it's something unique to Apple, right? It's in the same people's brain. They know why they wake up and build this feature or why they message it that way, because it needs to solve this problem better than some other product that might already exist.
And finally, we talked to Roman Gunn, VP of Product at Zeta Global, who came on to talk about his experience with what he calls a design North Star and how he uses that to create a roadmap based on customer needs, opportunities, and industry demands.
So I love to start with something called a design North Star. So essentially work with great design folk to create a end state that we're trying to reach. What is the ultimate thing that we're moving towards? And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to use all our standardized components. It doesn't have to have all the answers in terms of deep flows, but it has ultimately where and why we're going. And because of that, it brings the reality of the end state much closer. It starts to, one, feel more attainable and feasible. And two, it gives a common language and something for people to point toward. I think that one of the things that I've learned in my career is that it's unfair to make people imagine at times. You want to give them something to reference. And by having a visual aid that they can say, oh, this is one, polished, two, this has all the elements that I want, and three, like, how do we get there now? I think that's the thing that we really try to build. And then based on that, we then start creating different phases of how do we build towards that, right? So we start figuring out what are the most essential solutions, what are the solutions that scale into other parts of the product, and essentially the entire architecture of how it's going to work. But it all starts with, this is where we're going. Because without that, I think a lot of companies fall into what I call the incremental march to nowhere. They just build and measure, but where are you going? It's great that you moved like another mile, but a mile towards what? So that's what we want to avoid.
Yeah, makes sense. And when you're building that work back plan, what are you working back from? Because there's always, I think, given the nature of products you work on, you could be looking at where you're going to be 3 years out. Where do you want to be a year out? There's always this kind of idea of what's critical. And then there's all the add-on things that you could add on. Are you starting from the end state? Or are you starting from what's the minimum we need to do to launch what we need to launch initially and then go, or how does that work? How are you looking at all the additional things you can do afterwards?
Yeah. So we start with the end state and then we figure out what are the most impactful points in getting there. what are the things that the industry demands right now, and what are the biggest opportunities for us to grab? Because I always find it's interesting to balance between the necessity, the function, and the sizzle, right? You have to deliver both in lockstep because you're going to be missing out on different buyer types if you don't focus on both. So I always try to think of both the tactical and the strategic. So though you always have to the way I talk to PMs about this, sometimes it's like, look, you have to think about 60 to 70% functional ethics that people aren't going to necessarily celebrate or share, but it's going to make their life significantly easier. They're going to be locked into your ecosystem. And the other 30 to 40% is going to be the things that cause people to buy your platform in the first place.
And do you have a process for how you understand what those different elements are? Are you talking to customers? Is it gut feel? Is it a little bit of both or something else?
Yeah. So you definitely need to work with individual business units you have. You definitely need to work with the people who are in the weeds actually using the platform, because those things aren't aligned always. And then you do have to intuit a bit of where things are going to go, right? Because it's one thing to build what a competitor has. It's another thing to say, I want to be better than a competitor. And you can't do that by copying. You have to do that by finding inspiration. And sometimes that inspiration is best found not within a competitor. It's best found within an entirely different space. Because I think one of the things that I've appreciated working in an agency environment earlier in my career is being able to see how much of the problem sets we try to tackle are similar from industry to industry. There's a lot of, if you do some good pattern matching, 70% baseline of problems are the same. How do we templatize things and scale them and make them repeatable? And we operationalize the folks that are hands on keyboard. How do we keep the strategic users happy? And it's same from industry to industry. The difference in the scope working solution. So if you think about those different pillars that you have to hit, you have to pattern match against it. And now that you know that the pattern's there, you just look at the most interesting and compelling and easy solution, even if it doesn't come directly from your field.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, right, having experiences across lots of things, like we said, the windy road gets you to it. So, now, I think you have when I was reading our background here, you have 5 pods over at Zeta. What are they focused on? It's not just all generative AI, is it?
No, it's not. At Zeta, we actually have, before the pod layer level, the layers. So we have the intelligence layer, which is where all the pods that I head up are. Then we also have the experience layer and the data layer. So the data layer is all about how we ingest information, how we make sure that there's great governance around that, great security around it, et cetera. We have the experience layer for how do you execute on all these things? How do you actually create segments? How do you send your emails? How do you target on CTV or other display channels or direct mail, et cetera? Then you have the intelligence layer, which is how do you combine all the data that's ingested into something that's meaningful and actionable? And in order to do that, we have things like analytics, we have things like forecasting, we have things like recommendations, we have things like personalization, and we have things like MLOps and generative AI. So those are kind of the pods that we're tackling. And the next pod that we're going to be standing up is going to be splitting off attribution from analytics into its own dedicated space.
I won't get on my soapbox today, but attribution is one of the ones that I have lots of opinions.
Come this summer when the cookieless world kind of crumbles, we're going to have to figure out how do we really attribute it in a meaningful way? What's this right point of view to have in a world where people do want to feel like they're secure, that their privacy is being respected, but they also still get the relevant type of marketing to them. So that's something that we really have to focus on. How does the marketer really credit the right channel? Because, you have last touch models, first touch models, all those models are out of touch. So we have to figure out the right way to do it.
It's such an interesting problem. I've worked at, I think, 10 plus companies at this point, over 20 years of working in marketing, and no one does it the same. I don't think anyone's dead on right, but I don't think any of them are dead on wrong either. So it's just, it's a passionate topic of mine. I digress.
Yes. Well, I think this is right. And that this is going to be the big challenge, I think, again, come this summer, where it's just this is an opportunity for people to unite on what is the formula for this? Can we standardize this? Lots of other technologies, whether it's USB-C or whatever have you, they said, okay, enough of all the wires. Let's pick a universal standard. Maybe it's time for attribution to do the same.
And that's it for this week on LaunchPod. Be sure to follow us and review us if you like this podcast, and come back next week to hear a brand new episode. See you then.